story to the examiner. You have to let the examiner know that you know the patient's story and you have to tell the story to the examiner. But just to make it standard and so that you don't deviate and wander here or there, you need to have a format to it. And it is very important that by the time you go to your final examinations, you have that format pit-pat. Because only if you have a format can you take that exam in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, whatever, take that case and then present it in 10 minutes. If you don't have a format, if you don't have a system, you cannot progress. So obviously this is the way it goes. The most important thing is to start with the primary. You must have your first line of your history, of your presentation, has to be the primary complaint. You cannot be waffling around. That has to be it. You start with one, hit it with that, and then continue with the others. That primary complaint must have an origin, duration, it must have the progress, how it's going. You must then have a history of etiology and then of complications. So if you follow this simple format, then you would be able to get through almost any case, because like I said, it's a matter of filling that time that you have to present and to tell a story to the examiner and let the examiner feel like you know something about it, even if you know very little about it. And if you follow this format, you will be able to fill the time and you will be able to fill that thing. And this would be true for all, definitely for spine, but for other things as well. So primary complaints, origin, duration, progress, some other secondary complaints, then a history which gets you to the etiology of the problem, and then some history which tells you what complications this problem is causing. So in spine it would be function, so you talk about walking distance, standing time and other functions. You speak about neurology, where you speak about motor, sensory, you speak about the bladder, which is very important. Please do not forget the bladder and bowel. You have to mention it. And the other systems like abdomen, hip, etc. Now the issue here is, the point is that in this very short time, the examiner has to know, or at least think that you know, right? He has to think that, okay, you know what you're talking about. Therefore, you have to be very, very intelligent. Every word of yours counts. You have to be very intelligent in what you tell the examiner. And even your negative history has to be very specific. So if you give a non-specific negative history, the examiner will fall asleep. And at the end of the day, he will not remember you. And if he doesn't remember you, he will not pass you. So even a negative history has to be very specific. So if it's a bladder and you give a negative history, he will realize you have thought about it and you have asked about it. But if you give some other non-specific negative history which has no meaning and it just goes on and on, he is bored, you are losing your time and you are not getting any kind of attention from the examiner. So of course most of our things are back pain, that's how it starts, but you need to describe the pain in a slightly better way. And you need to grossly categorize it as mechanical and inflammatory. These are the two, the third one you can ignore. So mechanical is one which is related to the physical structure of the spine, and therefore the prime thing is that it is aggravated by activity and relieved by rest. And it's very important to know that part of it, and it's very important for you to bring it out to the examiner. And of course this would have its own mechanical reasons. On the other hand is the inflammatory back pain, which you need to be able to again elicit from your history. And this is an actual disease in the spine, and this pain is present even at rest. And it would be some of these causes such as infections or tumors. And like I said, in the specific negative history, there is the so-called night pains, and you need to mention that as well. So another tip is to set up examiners for a question. You set up, it's like, the spinners who bowl a ball so that somebody hits it and tries to hit a six but actually gets out. It's the same way, you need to give a lollipop to the examiner for him to ask you a question, the answer of which you know. So please don't set up an examiner to ask you a question, the answer which you don't know, right? So please, you have to be very smart about this. So for instance, if you say something like, no night cries, no night pains, some guy may suddenly wake up, oh, what causes night pains? And you need to know that, please. So you need to know what causes night pains to be able to say that. So that's how you set up examiners for a question. And the other way of doing it is also to have a bit of a pause. It's a very fine art to play the examiner. So no night pains. Wait 1 second. Don't continue. No night pains, hip, knees, and jaw. He don't want to jump in. When you're presenting, the patient has pain which is not related to activity. Pain is present even at rest, and patient has night pain. The patient also has. So you've given that one and a half second for the examiner to ask you a question, the answer of which you know. right? Not a question, the answer which you don't know. You then need to go through all the causes, of course, the mechanical causes, the inflammatory disorders, infections. So I'm not going to go through all this. This is theory, and I don't want to teach you theory because theory can be read, and this is just a presentation to be there. But you need to be able to differentiate non-specific back pains from specific back pains, and there are some red flags which can be asked you in the exam. So pain unrelated to movement or posture, which is again inflammatory pain, systemic or constitutional symptoms which you need to cover, age less than 20 or more than 55 at first episode, and neurologic symptoms and deformity. The other thing is you must be able to categorize the pain, whether it's sudden after an activity or whether it is crept on. So this is also very important as to whether he bent to lift a weight and he got the pain, or he had a fall, he slipped, he did something, went for a bout of tennis and then got the pain. So that is one part. Or insidious, it crept up slowly. So that would be an insidious pain, would be more in favor of an inflammatory or infective disorder. You need to look at the duration as well, whether it's a short duration or long duration or a subacute. So if somebody comes with a history of 20 years of back pain, it is very less likely to be anything significant. But for a subacute pain like 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, it can be some very important thing. You need to look at the course of the pain. Is it a static pain? Is it there same pain for the last 3 months? Is it improving, in which case you are not bothered? Is it worsening, in which case you are bothered, or whether it's off and on? So that means the back pain may not be related really to the disease what he's presenting to you with, if he has off and on back pain. And you need to look at the aggravating and relieving factors, position, posture, coughing, sneezing, and night pain. Like I told you, night pain important. Coughing and sneezing is another one. Like if you know the answer, then you can say that okay, this pain is worsened by coughing and sneezing. So that immediately sets you up for the next question. What does it signify? Why does it signify this? And I'm sure you know the answer to this, right? All of you? Yes? Anyone? No? Then you need to talk about the case presentation is there. Don't worry, I'm going to catch you up. So next is the pain, how it travels. Like does it radiate into the lower limbs? And is it a radiation, a true radiation, or is it a referred pain? Because you can even get a referred pain because of simple disc annular tear or facet joint. But the problem, if it goes below the knee, then it is definitely a radiating pain or a nerve pain. And if it's above the knee, it may not be. It may even be just a referred pain. You have to see whether it's unilateral or bilateral and whether it's associated with paresthesias. So paresthesias in our English, Indian English is known as tingling numbness, but it's basically paresthesia. You need to ask for history of claudication, and you should be able to differentiate the neurogenic versus vascular claudication, and you have to talk about its distance and its progression. So when you are describing claudication, you have to say that 6 months ago, this patient was able to walk 1 kilometer, and now the patient is able to walk 200 meters. In your history, so like I told you, the first sentence was that you have to know something about everything, but there are some things about which you must know everything, and one of those things is the difference between neurogenic and vascular claudication. If you don't know, if you are not able to come up with that answer to the standard question, then you would deserve to fail. Right? Because these are a few things which are like lollipops which you have to know. So anybody who doesn't know the difference between neurogenic and vascular claudication? Good, everybody knows. Check shirt. Yes, you have to look at your shirt. You're the only one with the check shirt. Difference between neurogenic and vascular claudication.
When the back is flexed, the neurological claudication gets better.
Okay.
Vascular, it doesn't get better. There will be heaviness if it's a vascular claudication.
Is it? Okay. And okay, but can you tell me only one difference? Only one difference. Anyone who's going to put up a hand for only one difference? There are 10, of course, but there's only one. Yes.
Start with unilateral node.
Okay. Now the one who's put up right shirt. Yes.
So vascular claudication, it is a fixed distance. Patient walk and pain gets.
By sitting down. Please. Yes, no. If there is only one answer, is that the answer? It is. It is not because I say so. It is because it is the only answer. And this you are supposed to know in 3rd MBBS for your general surgery. Okay. I can explain it further if you want. It's because vascular claudication is caused because of vascular steal. So even when they stand in one place, it's because the muscles are utilizing that, right? And there is a relative ischemia. So then as soon as they stand in the place, again they get. Whereas neurogenic claudication, because of stenosis in the lumbar spine, only when they sit, the canal diameter increases and the pain goes. So this is one, but there are many differences. Since you all don't even know one, I'm not going to tell you the others. But like I said, this is one question whose answer you need to know. Okay? Because I will tell you why. If this is the third question the examiner asks and you don't know it, for the next half an hour he's not even paying attention to you because he has already failed you. He has already failed you because why? Because Sandeep Patwardhan's son is there and he's already phoned him and said, "Usko pass karna padega." You understand? That's the problem. So the problem is that they want to pass a limited number of people, and the minute you make a mistake, which is a blunder, and somebody has not phoned for you, you're out of it. So don't make a blunder like this. Like I said, the way to then describe it is the distance and the progression. To be able to tell whether it is worsening or not, you have to be able to tell the distance. Other features, you need to look at constitutional symptoms, fever, malaise, weight loss, etc. And these are all historic points which lead you to the diagnosis of etiology. Etiology of malignancy would be all of these, you know this. Then you talk about the complications. So falling while running. So that's how a very early late onset paraplegia is actually found out that way. Children, when they start running, they fall down. So that's very important. Relevant past history, infection, contact, all of these. And at the end of your history, you should be able to come to some sort of diagnosis. So when your history is over, you should be able to say what. So usually there are two things to orthopedic diagnosis. There is the what and there is the where. And you usually tell the what at the end of the history and you tell the where at the end of the examination. Yes or no? So these are the basic, again like I said, if you have only that much, you have half an hour for the long case and I think 10 minutes for 3 short cases if I'm not mistaken. And unless you have a format, unless you follow a format, you can't, you can't beat that time and you'll be anyway flustered. So time stands still. That half an hour will finish in 5 minutes when you're actually doing the exam. You think, half an hour is already over. So you have to have a format, you have to have a system which you follow. Your history system was that, your examination system is this. If you follow the format, you will finish it. You need to inspect, you need to palpate, look at the movements, then there are special tests, neurological examination, other joints, abdomen, pelvis. You follow all these points, tick, 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 and you have finished your examination. If the patient is able to walk, you need to look at the gait as well. And some of the neurologic disorders are diagnosed by the gait alone, like a myelopathic gait, or an unsteady gait, or a high steppage gait. So this will give you more brownie points. If at the gait itself, if the patient has a foot drop and you can say he has a high steppage gait, he is unable to walk on heels or toes, this gives you points right at the beginning. You need to look at a list, whether the patient has a list. So that's the gait, the list you should be able to look at. How will you differentiate one test only between a list and an actual lumbar scoliosis?
Forward bending.
Very good. So, gives me some hope. In deformity, again, that's a different examination altogether. You need to look at some of the things. You need to look at the shoulder level. You need to look at the waistline, pelvic obliquity. You need to look at the plumb line. So this is what examiners really like, a plumb line. And you need to look at the trunk shift. And you need to look at the rib hump. I'm not sure whether you are expected to carry scoliometers, but if you are, at least you can ask for a scoliometer in the exam. On inspection, you look for swellings, cold abscesses, etc. You look for scars and sinuses. You look for muscle spasm, where the way it's seen is that the midline furrow is exaggerated. You look for hairy tufts, cafeolus patches, and cutaneous. So this is what I'm trying to tell you is that negative history. So if there's a deformity case, if there is a scoliosis case, you should be able to say that these things are not there, because that shows that you are thinking about it. Also, it may set them up for a question. So if for instance you say hairy tuft, so absence, there is no hairy tuft, there is no cutaneous stigmata, that may set you up for a question. Why are you looking for it? Cafeolus patches, again, why are you looking for it? So that's very important. Palpation, universally in medicine, the first thing is you look for temperature and tenderness, and only then do you talk about other things. You confirm the other findings, and you palpate the midline. So you start with the midline, where you look at the spinous processes themselves and the interspinous ligaments. and then you look at the paraspinal, where you look at the muscles and the facet joints, and the SI joints and the trigger points. But also you look at rotatory tenderness. So when you try to rotate, because that is indicative of an anterior. So like I said, direct pressure, pushing and rotation will tell you about the anterior tenderness. You need to know the vertebral levels. Sometimes some people like to draw them on the patient. I'm not really sure whether you should or you shouldn't. You can take a call. But some people like to draw it on the patient as well, especially in the deformity patients. And you need to know all of these. Then you look at the range of motion, and here is the famous Schober's test, which again you all need to know about. What is the Schober's, what is the modified, and what is the modified Schober's test. The point is, it looks at the lumbar range of motion and takes certain fixed points. So the first test, which is the basic Schober's test, took only L1 to L5. So they looked at the PSIS, took a tape measure 10 centimeter above, and on full flexion, they see if it's less than 5 centimeter, it was positive, or there's a stiff lumbar spine. But then they thought they would do a modified one, where they took 10 above and 5 below, which covered even the L5-S1 junction. And then the modified, because they said that we can't really see the L5-S1 junction well, so they just took a full 15 centimeter tape from the PSIs. Right? So as I said, 5 centimeters is the kind of cutoff. The same thing can be done in the dorsal spine as well, and that's known as Ott's test. It's a very weird word, but it's Ott's test, where you look at C7 and you look at the expression. The next is the nerve or the root tension signs, which are very, very important, which surely in any lumbar spine case you will be asked to demonstrate. And I think there's a spine case, so I'm assuming it's going to be there. And you look at the straight leg raise, you look at the Lassax's test, Fajastan, which is a dorsiflexion test, Bose-Tringy, cross SLR and flip test. And here again you need to know some of the things you have to know, like okay, how to do a straight leg test. We'll hopefully, if you have a PS, we'll show how to demonstrate it, and what it Lassax's test, Bose-Tringy. We'll cover that in the examination actually. So I'm not going to go through this. You also, because like I said, it's root tension signs, it's not only SLR, so the femoral nerve test has to be covered by it as well. You need to look at the SI joint, and SI joint tests are a favorite of examiners. The reason why it's a favorite of examiners is that the general orthopedic examiner who's sitting there throughout that spine case and has no idea about spine suddenly wakes up because he knows the SI joint tests. So you need to know the SI joint tests, right? So Genslin's or the pump handle test, this one you need to know. You need to look at the Faber test, and so other special tests, which this talk is just meant to, there's no way that in 3 days we can teach you this. This is meant to encourage you to read the right books and do it. Then look at the neurological examination, motor sensory. Again, you follow a system and you will be through. The best system, if you ask me, even today, is your PJ Mehta from 3rd MBBS. If you follow PJ Mehta for neurological examination, you will not miss anything. So you will exactly follow that system, where you do motor, sensory, reflex and CNS, and then when you go ahead in motor, you do tone, nutrition, power, coordination, reflexes. So if you follow that system, you will not miss anything and the examiner will not be able to catch you. You need to know the MRC grading, there's no doubt about it. You need to know your root values as well, which movement or which muscle test which root value, and this can be sort of found out in the. You need to be able to look at the reflexes. Reflexes are graded as well, where 2 is a normal reflex, 1 is a depressed reflex, and 3 is exaggerated and 4 is clonus. You need to be able to demonstrate, which we'll do on the patient, both the ankle as well as the patellar clonus. You need to know the root values, so I'm not going to sit and read them out to you. And this we will demonstrate on how to do. You should be able to elegantly demonstrate this. Superficial reflexes, again, you need to start from the bottom, the plantar, the abdominal, the cremasteric, bulbocavernosus and anal wing. Bulbocavernosus, especially if it's a male. No one's paying attention actually. And sensory, again, touch, temperature, pain. So here again, temperature. So there are some things. So your exam is a bit of a drama. It's like not necessarily, you don't take it seriously as an exam. It's a bit of a drama which everyone has to go through. You also have to go through and the examiner also has to go through. And part of that drama is trying to show that, oh God, you're so sincere and you know everything. So you may or may not want to really know whether the patient has temperature, this thing, but the way to know it is you need to ask the guy for the hot and cold test tubes, right? You need to ask. If you haven't asked, or if there's an examiner who is a nasty guy, he will just keep an eye. So I know examiners will do that. You are examining there because you're the next guy, and they just see that you have not asked for the hot and cold, and they call you and temperature, and you say, no, the temperature is equal. This is what you didn't ask for the test tube. How do you know? So that's the thing. So the hot and cold test tube, the tuning fork, the cotton, you need to ask for all of that if it is there or if it is not there. The hot and cold test tube you can't carry it. It will become cold by the evening. You have to ask for it.
Talking of this tuning forks and all that carried.
Tuning fork, the student has to carry it, or the tray is given by the hospital?
The hospitals don't.
Really? Okay.
Be safe, they should carry.
Okay. So please carry tuning forks. Yes, sir. सर आपका कुछ ये है क्या? शॉप ट्यूनिंग फोक्स का? ठीक है. So take the important. This is what you're here for. Carry the tuning fork. Dermatomes, again, you need to know what the dermatomes are, but what's important in spine are the autologous zones. Again, we'll cover it in the examination, but the point is that autologous zones are those which exclusively test one particular dermatome. So this is because of the phenomenon of overlap. You need to know what they are: medial malleolus, first dorsal web space, and lateral border of foot. You need to again examine the other system like hips, knees, SI joints, abdomen, pelvis. You need to examine. Don't leave it. And hip and please don't forget the hips and the knees in a spine case, because you can land up in soup. And I don't just mean in the case in the exam, even in your practice, please don't miss it. In case you ever make the big mistake of becoming a spine surgeon, please don't forget the hips and the knees. If you pick up some hip and knee pathology and you refer them to the right people, they'll refer some spine cases to you. Make sure about the vascular as well. So again, to go through it, this is what we went through: inspection, palpation, movements, special tests, neurologic examination, other joints, abdomen and pelvis. And like I told you, at the end of the history, the thing is, what is the problem? And at the end of the examination, where is the problem? So you should be able to tell what the disease is. When you're giving your diagnosis, you should be, that also should have a format. The format is the primary diagnosis, what is the etiology and what is the complication. So you can say like, you know, right-sided L5 radiculopathy in a 45-year-old laborer due to herniated disc at L4-5 etiology with disability of pain for the last 6 months and weakness of the L5 root. So that is how the format of your diagnosis goes. So now that more people have stretched their legs, a few words about exams. So my question is, how many of you here, please raise your hands, who are looking for a gold medal? Who's? But the gold medalists are not come here only, they are busy studying. Anyway, let me tell you one thing. There is only one aim which you guys should have, like that, this thing, and that is to pass the exam. In future, it does not matter whether you have the gold medal or not. I could give you a few examples, but I didn't get the gold medal, so it's not that important. It's important to pass. Now, how do you pass the exam? Like I said, you have only one aim on that day. I don't know whether DNB is slightly different from MS, but in MS, everything was decided on the practicals. And in the practicals, almost everything was decided on the short case. So you could like elevate or worsen, but the short cases were like the key, and then the long case was very important. And by the time the tables come, everybody's tired. What happens is that for an examiner, how they work is that at the end of the day, they make a result. Right? At the end of the day, they make a result, and they would have examined maybe 8, 9, 10, 12 candidates in that day. And your aim is to let the examiner feel that he deserves to pass, which means you should not try to be too bright, nor try to be too stupid. Because if they don't remember you, they are very likely to pass you that, okay, this guy had answered a few things. What the examiners do, from my thing is, it is not possible, like in a theory paper, that they mark you constantly. Because they are asking questions, they are thinking as well. What they usually write down, if you see on their paper, there are two things. One is at the end they write a general impression. So there are some funny code which you don't even know what it is. 1, 2, 2.5, 3. Even I have tried to figure out what it is, but not really. But sometimes they write down something which you have said, something very good or something very bad. So if you say something very bad, the problem is that that is remembered, and at the end of the discussion, when they sit together, in case they sit together to give a result, they will say that, oh, this is the guy who said this, we cannot pass it. Okay? So that is where you need to make sure that you step on the middle line. Try to avoid going into a direction where you are saying something completely wrong. At the same time, don't try to take the discussion to a higher level. Just because you read one thing very well, don't necessarily try to pull it there, because the examiner can always make the discussion go to a higher level where he can make you stumble and fall. Just remember this, the examiner knows more than you. In case you know more than the examiner, refer to the first rule. The examiner still knows more than you. The point is that the examiner is the one who is going to give you marks. You are not going to give marks to the examiner. So on that day, he is the main guy, right? Point is that if you tread the middle path, if you try to just not go too high or too low, the chances are that you will pass, because overall he has not really come to fail you. He wants to pass people. Right? He has come all the way not to fail people. He wants to pass you. He has only that half an hour or 45 minutes to evaluate you in those cases. In that, if you answer more questions correctly, he will remember that and he will pass you. In that, if you try to take it to higher, so suppose somebody else takes it to a higher level, in which he answers 6 super answers which nobody else knows and doesn't answer 4. And another guy has been just mediocrely answering, he's answered only 8 mediocre things. The guy with the 8 mediocre things will pass. Because the examiner will remember that, okay, he answered 8 questions, he's passed. He will not say that this was at a higher level and therefore failed. So that's what you have to do. You need to keep the examiner exactly at that level, at the medium level, where you are answering questions and it looks as if answering questions. Which also means that if you don't know something, just say, I don't know. The examiner will not chase you. If you don't know and you keep waffling, the examiner will keep chasing you, will keep chasing you, keep chasing you, and you will keep giving more negative answers rather than letting that thing go and go to the next positive answer. So that's very, so I don't know is also a very important thing, and there is no shame in not knowing. You really can't know everything. So you can say, I'm sorry sir, I don't know. The examiner, there will be among the 4, there will be one kind guy who will take the question somewhere else. Nobody is going to be chasing the, what do you mean you don't know? ऐसा नहीं है. So that's important. The other thing is your demeanor. Like you have to have, like I said, middle path. A good, confident demeanor. You should be well dressed. I mean, this is a basic thing. There is no excuse. If you think that by going unshaven and the thing that examiner think कि वाह कितना पढ़ाई करता है, रात भर पढ़ाई किया दाढ़ी का टाइम नहीं मिला. No, you have to look decent, be confident in the way you are, stand straight, smile like the examiner, be polite, speak in a measured way, and like I said, when you are confident and polite, that will show. If you try to act as particularly scared, that doesn't work. If you try to be overconfident, again, that's a problem because the examiner may not like it. Because on that day, no matter what it is, on that day, he's the examiner and you're the candidate. So have a measured way of talking, be polite, listen to the question, don't jump. There are many people I've seen who jump at the answer and somebody asks, this, wait, listen for the question, let it sink in, answer the question politely, look at the examiner, make eye contact when you're answering. And I think, I have a lot of tips. I can speak for 1 hour on how to pass an exam, but they gave me only 20 minutes. So I think, and every other tell me next year we're going to give you. But if you just follow these few basic things, follow the middle path, don't try to do too much, don't try to do too less.